All right, so according to a study conducted in 2010 by the University of Auckland, the language development gap between children with hearing and children with hearing loss widens over time, meaning that a child that is already behind in their language development because they have hearing loss is going to continually get more behind as they get older. So as a speech pathology major, I found this really interesting, and I wanted to figure out what was being done to close this gap. So through my research, I learned about something called auditory-verbal therapy, and today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about what auditory-verbal therapy is, how effective it is in closing this gap, what I concluded from my research, and then also the future research that needs to be done about this sort of therapy. Okay, so what is auditory-verbal therapy? Auditory-verbal therapy is a type of speech therapy for children with hearing loss, obviously, that have either hearing aids or cochlear implants. And a cochlear implant is a type of hearing aid that is surgically implanted into the child's ear. It's kind of like in the bone area behind your cochlea. So the focuses of auditory-verbal therapy include early identification of hearing loss, meaning that children are screened as babies to see how profound their hearing loss is, development of listening skills, education in mainstream classes with typical hearing peers, and then parental involvement, because the parent is going to be the one that is most involved inside the child's language development. Okay, so the three studies that I looked at, they were conducted in 2009, 2010, and 2014, and all of them measured speech scores based on two different speech assessments called the CELF and the PLS-4. And these are universal tests, meaning that they take typical hearing kids and they have norms based on age equivalencies, meaning that a student should be, say if they're 5 years old, then they should have this score here, and they should be an age equivalent of 5. Well, some kids fall below that. So these two tests measured both receptive and expressive language scores, and they took those scores and they can compare them to the norms. Okay, so like I said, I looked at the three different studies, and I looked at them based on receptive language test scores, expressive language test scores, and then I took those scores and compared them to scores of typical hearing children. All right, so receptive language is language that is heard or read and understood. So it's more of a comprehensive sort of language. And the 2009 study took these kids through AVT, and they found out that the pretest and post scores showed an improvement of 3.56 to 5.17. So they did improve. And then the 2010 study showed a drop in the percentage of kids that fell below the mean, meaning that they improved as well. And then last but not least, the growth rate of the last study was about 5 points per 6-month interval of therapy. And then in the expressive language study, they found that the children also increased in their age equivalencies. And then 5 of 7 children in the 2010 study showed improvements. And then the last one, they had a growth rate of about 5 points per 6-month interval as well. So I took those scores and compared them to the typical hearing children. And in the 2009 study, they showed that the developmental progress for both the AVT group and the typical hearing group was at the same rate, meaning that both of the children were developing and getting better at the same sort of rate. And then in the 2010 study, the CELF scores still fell below the normative mean, meaning that although the children did improve, they didn't really meet the standard typical scores that you're supposed to have at a certain age. And then in the 2014 study, they showed that some children caught up to the norms, but others fell below or behind. So what can we do to make auditory-verbal therapy better? I concluded that the children that took auditory-verbal therapy did improve in areas of hearing loss, or did improve in areas of expressive and receptive language, but they did not meet the normal scores for their age. I'm sorry. So what can we do to improve AVT? One of the things that I think would be interesting to look at is typical hearing control groups. In the 2010 study, they did have a typical hearing control group that had the same pre-test and post-test as the children that had auditory-verbal therapy, but not all the studies did this. So if they took typical hearing children and they matched the children that were in AVT based on socioeconomic level, initial language age, thing like that, it would be easier to tell if the children in AVT were developing at the same rate that they should. So also I think another important thing to look at would be the type of hearing device used. If a child has a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, it might depend on whether or not they do better, because cochlear implants are more technologically efficient, and they're kind of the new and improved thing. And then the age of identification of hearing loss is also an issue, because a child that finds out at 2 years old that they have hearing loss and have had some sort of sensory device, the longest, is obviously going to be better than a child who got that at 8 and is still learning how to develop with their sensory device. And then parent education and language skills are also an important factor, because the parent, like I said earlier, is obviously the one that's going to be working with the child the most, and the kid's going to learn the most from the parent. So if a parent isn't educated or doesn't have language development skills up to their age, it's going to be really hard for them to show their child speech skills and how they should develop. And then also, I think that sign language in conjunction with auditory-verbal therapy would be interesting, because now elementary schools are even implementing sign language in order for kids to learn English in general. So why not use that with kids with hearing loss as well? So I think with this future research, we can figure out what the best method is to help children with hearing loss, and we can figure out if AVT is what we need to use for that. Thank you.
And the scars that mark my body